On a golden afternoon in Montana, Clara Williams thought her wedding day would be nothing but laughter and vows beneath the wide-open sky. But when her aging German shepherd, Max, stepped forward and clamped his teeth gently on her gown, refusing to let her enter the chapel, the celebration froze in stunned silence. What he was hiding wasn't a tantrum or confusion. It was a truth that would turn her perfect day into a race against time, love, and fate itself. This is a story of loyalty, instinct, and the mysterious ways God sends us warnings through those who love us most. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The town of Livingston, Montana, in the summer of 2022, looked like something carved out of a painting of the American West. The mountains rose like jagged blue guardians in the distance, their peaks still dusted with stubborn streaks of snow, even in late June. The Yellowstone River, restless and silver under the sun, curved through the valley as if determined to remind the land that nothing ever stood still. The afternoon heat pressed against the clapboard houses and wide streets, while the wind, always restless in Montana, swept across the open prairie, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and dust. In this place, the weather was as much a character as any person. Harsh, unrelenting, but honest in its power. It was a town where people measured life not by the ticking of clocks, but by the turning of seasons, by the resilience demanded from every soul who dared to call it home. On this day, the town gathered near a small white wooden chapel that stood at the edge of the prairie, its steeple sharp against the endless sky. A bell rope swayed lazily in the breeze, and the old wooden boards of the porch creaked as guests walked up the steps, dressed in pastel dresses and crisp suits. It was Clara Williams's wedding day, and though the town had seen its share of heartbreaks, tragedies, and fleeting romances, it felt as if the prairie itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Clara was 29 years old, tall and slender with a delicate grace that reminded people of the wind-blown reeds by the river. Her strawberry blonde hair was arranged in a loose twist, strands escaping here and there to frame a face that seemed both youthful and tired by unspoken burdens. Her pale skin, dotted lightly with freckles across her cheeks, glowed in the light. She was a music teacher at the local high school, known not just for her skill with the piano and violin, but also for the way she coaxed shy children into finding their voices. Clara's nature was patient and warm, the kind that put people at ease, though there was a sadness in her green eyes that had never fully left since her father's sudden death years ago. Music and teaching had healed her, but it was Max, her German shepherd, who had been her truest comfort during those lonely days. Her fiancé, Daniel Brooks, waited nervously near the altar inside the chapel. Daniel was 32, a doctor at the county hospital. He was broad-shouldered and slightly stooped at the neck, a man whose tall frame bore the wear of years spent standing for long hours in the ER. His hair was dark, trimmed short, but often falling into his forehead as if to soften his serious expression. A faint line of stubble covered his jaw, giving him a rugged look that contrasted with the kindness in his hazel eyes. Daniel was admired in town, not only for his skill as a physician, but also for his willingness to sit with families long after shifts ended, explaining with calm patience what others might rush through. The burden of witnessing too many deaths in his early career had made him quiet, reflective, but it had also forged in him a fierce loyalty to those he loved. Clara was his anchor, the light that steadied him after nights of despair in the ER. But the truest guardian of Clara's heart stood by her side that day, a creature whose presence commanded both awe and affection. Max was a German shepherd, 12 years old, his once black muzzle streaked heavily with gray. His amber eyes were deep pools of wisdom and weariness, eyes that had watched over Clara through every storm of her young adulthood. His body, though still strong, had softened with age. His fur was thick, a blend of faded black and tan, carrying the musky scent of time. Max was not a dog of playful leaps anymore, but of deliberate movements, a creature of dignity. He had been with Clara since college, chosen from a shelter on the very day she had buried her father. Max had pressed his head against her trembling hands that day, and something unspoken had passed between them. An unbreakable covenant. From then on, he became her shadow, her protector, her silent witness to both grief and joy. As the wind pushed against the chapel doors, Clara stepped carefully onto the wooden porch, her lace gown trailing behind her like a wave of ivory. The fabric shimmered in the sunlight, delicate embroidery catching glints of gold. Guests turned, faces lit with smiles, some with tears already welling at the sight of her. Clara held a small bouquet of wildflowers, lupine, daisies, and a single red rose in memory of her father. Her heart beat fast, not just with excitement, but with a quiet unease she couldn't name. It was then that Max moved. The old dog, who had been lying quietly at the side of the porch, suddenly rose to his feet. His movements were slower now, hindered by stiff joints, but there was urgency in the way he stood. He padded across the porch, his nails clicking against the wood, and stepped directly into Clara's path. For a moment, the guests chuckled softly, assuming it was a sweet gesture of companionship. But the air shifted when Max lowered his head, teeth catching lightly at the hem of her gown, refusing to let her take another step. Clara froze, looking down at him. His grip wasn't aggressive, it was almost pleading. His amber eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that stilled her breath. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "He doesn't want her to go in." Another voice said, "He's just old, maybe confused." But Clara knew Max better than anyone. This wasn't confusion. His body was tense, his chest rising and falling with effort, his breathing heavier than it had been just moments before. She knelt down, bouquet slipping from her hand, and touched his graying head. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. His ears twitched, but he did not release the fabric. Instead, he pressed closer, as if trying to anchor her where she stood, refusing to let her move toward the door of the chapel. Inside, Daniel shifted, glancing toward the doorway, his brows furrowed in confusion. He could not see clearly from where he stood, only the commotion of guests and the figure of Clara stooped beside her loyal companion. He took a step forward, but the best man laid a hand on his shoulder, urging him to wait. On the porch, time seemed to slow. The laughter of children, the rustle of skirts, even the wind itself felt suspended. Clara's heart raced. She could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, but all she could see was Max. For the first time on this day, her wedding day, she felt a crack in the world she had so carefully built, as though the old German shepherd knew something she did not. His silent protest, his refusal to let her walk forward, was not an accident. It was a message. And in that moment, with her gown held captive in the jaws of a dog who had never once failed her, Clara realized that her perfect day had just shifted into something else entirely. Something unexpected, something fateful, and perhaps something that would change the course of her life forever. The moment on the chapel porch, with Max holding firmly to her gown, triggered something deep within Clara's memory. The wind carried her backward in time, back to a day when grief had threatened to consume her whole world, and to the moment when an unlikely friend had stepped into her life. It was the autumn of 2010 in Great Falls, Montana. The air was sharp, cold enough that breath turned into clouds, and the golden leaves of cottonwood trees clung stubbornly to branches before dropping to the ground like whispers of time. The small town, nestled near the edge of the Malmstrom Air Force Base, was one where military families were as common as the sound of jet engines splitting the sky. Clara was 17 then, a lanky girl with long arms and a frame that hadn't yet grown into its elegance. Her hair, strawberry blonde even in youth, often tangled in the prairie wind, and her pale skin carried the freckles of summer even as winter crept closer. Her green eyes were bright once, filled with the music she loved to play. But in those days they were dulled, clouded by something heavier. Her father, Major Thomas Williams, had been a career Air Force pilot. A man of rigid posture, broad chest, and a square jaw permanently shadowed by stubble, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had stared death in the face many times and learned not to flinch. His hazel eyes, however, betrayed his softer side, especially with his daughters. He would kneel in his olive-green flight suit, scoop Clara into his arms when she was small, and tell her bedtime stories about flying through clouds as if they were castles in the sky. Yet beneath his strength was a man shaped by years of service, long deployments, the loss of friends, and the weight of responsibility. Clara had always seen him as invincible until the day the news came. It was supposed to be a routine training exercise. His plane went down over a barren stretch of Montana plain. By the time search and rescue arrived, there was nothing left to save. Clara remembered the knock at the door, her mother's strangled sobs, and the surreal moment of watching neighbors gather outside with lowered heads. She had run from the house, sprinting until her legs gave out in a field, where she screamed into the earth, clawing at the dirt with trembling fingers. Music didn't comfort her then, neither did words. The weeks that followed blurred together. Her mother retreated inward, a petite woman with auburn hair who once filled their home with warmth, but now moved like a shadow through the kitchen, her hands trembling over every dish, her voice reduced to whispers. Clara's younger sister, Maggie, only 15 at the time, lashed out, breaking things in her room, her sharp brown eyes filled with fury at a world that had stolen their father. Clara, caught between their grief, felt hollow. School became background noise, and even the piano, once a refuge, sat untouched, its ivory keys collecting dust. One afternoon, urged by a counselor, Clara was taken to the local rescue shelter just outside town. The building smelled faintly of disinfectant and hay, with chain-link kennels lined on either side of a dim corridor. The air was thick with barking, whimpering, and the restless scratching of claws. Clara walked with her head low, arms wrapped around her thin body as though she might hold herself together that way. She wasn't looking for anything. She didn't believe she deserved comfort anymore. That was when she saw him. At the far end of the shelter lay a German shepherd, young but gaunt, his ribs faintly visible beneath a coat of black and tan. His ears stood high despite his frailty, and his amber eyes locked onto hers with a startling intensity. Unlike the other dogs, he didn't bark, didn't leap against the gate. He simply stood, tail still, gaze steady, and in that gaze there was something Clara had not felt since her father's death. Recognition. As if he knew her sorrow. As if he carried his own. When the shelter worker, a heavy-set man named Rick with sun-beaten skin and a worn baseball cap, approached, he explained that the shepherd had been brought in weeks earlier, found wandering near a collapsed barn. They estimated he was about a year old, malnourished, wary of strangers. "Doesn't take too many people," Rick said gruffly, scratching his stubbled chin. "But if you ask me, he's waiting for the right one." Clara knelt slowly before the gate. Her fingers, pale and trembling, slipped through the cold metal. The shepherd hesitated only a second before pressing his muzzle against her hand, then lowering his head as if to surrender his weight into her. A sob broke loose from her chest, sudden and raw. For the first time since the funeral, her tears weren't born of anger or emptiness. They were met with silent understanding. She whispered, "Max." The name slipped from her lips without thought, as if it had always belonged to him. And from that day, he was hers. The adjustment wasn't easy. Max was cautious, easily startled, and carried the scars of abandonment. But so did Clara. She would wake at night from dreams of her father's crash, and there Max would be, curled at her side, his steady breathing grounding her. When Maggie slammed doors or shouted through her grief, Max would stand between the sisters, his body tense but his eyes calm, forcing them both to pause. Even their mother, fading in and out of depression, softened when Max laid his head on her lap, his weight pulling her back to the present moment. Through high school, Max became Clara's shadow. He followed her to the riverbanks where she practiced violin, sitting in the tall grass with ears tilted toward the music. When she left for college, studying music education in Missoula, she couldn't bear to leave him behind. Max became a familiar sight on campus, padding alongside her through the quad, his coat thickening in the Montana winters, his loyalty drawing smiles from professors and students alike. He was steady through late-night practices, breakups, exams, and long bus rides back home. By the time Clara graduated, Max had matured into a regal companion, broad-chested, muscular, but always gentle with children and strangers. His amber eyes no longer held the fear of his shelter days, but carried the calm of one who had found his place. To Clara, he was not just a pet. He was a guardian, a living reminder that even in the ashes of loss, new bonds could form. Bonds strong enough to carry her through the darkest valleys. Now, standing on the chapel porch years later, those memories pressed into her heart like the wind pressing against the prairie grass. Max's muzzle, now gray, was the same muzzle that had once nudged her trembling hand through the bars of a kennel. His eyes, though clouded with age, were the same eyes that had steadied her through grief and change. And as he held her gown tightly between his teeth, Clara understood. This was not rebellion, not confusion. This was Max, the friend born of loss, reminding her that sometimes the most important steps in life could not be taken without listening to those who had walked beside you through every storm. The murmurs began softly, like the rustling of prairie grass under a restless breeze. Guests leaned toward one another on the wooden pews inside the chapel and along the porch steps, their words hushed, yet sharp enough to sting. "He's just old," one man whispered, brushing his hand over his wife's arm. "Dogs lose their senses after a while." Another woman, wearing a pale lavender dress and a wide straw hat, shook her head with a frown. "No, that dog knows something. Look at his eyes." Clara stood frozen, her green eyes locked on Max's amber ones. The German shepherd's jaw was firm, his teeth catching the delicate lace of her gown, but his gaze was not wild or confused. It was deliberate, urgent, as though he were pleading with her in a language that only the two of them could share. The wind tugged at her veil. The wild flowers she had dropped lay scattered on the porch, and yet all she felt was the strange, heavy certainty that Max was trying to stop her for a reason. Inside the chapel, Daniel Brooks shifted uncomfortably. His broad shoulders straightened, his square jaw tightened, and his hazel eyes flicked nervously toward the scene unfolding. A sheen of sweat had gathered at his temples, not from the June heat, but from the pressure of dozens of eyes glancing at him in confusion. He adjusted the cuffs of his gray suit jacket, the fabric stretching across his muscular frame, and exhaled sharply. For a man used to holding life and death in his hands as a doctor, This moment felt oddly out of his control. Daniel was a man shaped by contrast, compassionate in the quiet of his home, yet hardened by what he had seen in sterile hospital rooms. During his residency in Chicago, he had once lost a child on his operating table, a boy no older than 7, and the image had never left him. It carved into his character a kind of protective instinct, making him fiercely loyal but also cautious. He looked at Max now and tried to reason it away. Turning to the nearest groomsman, he muttered, "He's sensing Clara's nerves, that's all." Dogs pick up on these things. His tone was steady, but the tightness around his mouth betrayed his unease. Among the guests sat Reverend Paul Kearney, the officiant of the wedding, a man in his late 50s with thinning silver hair combed carefully to the side and kind blue eyes framed by crow's feet. His frame was lean, his posture humble rather than commanding. The kind of man who had spent his life listening rather than preaching. He adjusted the collar of his simple black robe, watching the dog with a thoughtful expression. Reverend Paul had seen many weddings, many nervous brides and fidgeting grooms, but there was something in Max's posture, low, tense, unwavering, that made his stomach tighten. He had once served as a chaplain on rescue missions during wildfires in California, and he had seen dogs like Max before, animals that seemed to sense danger long before humans did. The guests' whispers grew bolder. A teenage boy in the back snickered, elbowing his friend. "Guess the dog's against the marriage." His laughter was cut short by the stern glance of his mother, a tall woman with short gray hair and stern features, softened only by her blue floral dress. "Show some respect," she hissed, though her own eyes betrayed a flicker of worry. Clara knelt slowly, ignoring the murmurs, her gown pooling around her on the porch like spilled cream. She pressed her hand against Max's head, feeling the coarse fur beneath her palm, streaked with the silver of age. His ears twitched, his breath came heavier than usual, and his eyes never left hers. She whispered, "Max, what is it? What are you trying to tell me?" Her voice trembled, a thin strand of fear weaving through the excitement that had carried her all morning. Daniel stepped to the doorway, his tall figure framed against the dim light inside. His hazel eyes softened as he looked at Clara, though impatience laced his words. "Clara, it's all right. He's old. He's confused. This is a big day, and dogs sense that kind of tension." His voice carried the careful tone of someone used to calming anxious patients. But Clara knew him too well. She saw the crease between his brows, the way his jaw clenched, the faint tremor in his hand as he rubbed the back of his neck. He was not convinced by his own reassurance. Clara rose to her feet, pulling gently at her gown, but Max held fast. A ripple of unease swept through her chest. She had lived with Max for 12 years. She knew the tilt of his ears, the subtle shift of his gaze, the way his body moved when he was merely nervous versus when something was truly wrong. This was not the aimless stubbornness of old age. This was purpose. From the edge of the porch, a bridesmaid named Hannah stepped closer. Hannah was Clara's childhood friend, a petite woman with honey-brown hair and lively hazel eyes, always quick to laugh but fiercely protective of those she loved. She touched Clara's arm, her voice low but urgent. "Clara, he doesn't look confused to me. Maybe you should listen." The air grew heavy with tension, the kind that makes even sunlight feel sharp. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. The whispers of the guests blurred into a single hum, but Max's breathing, deep, strained, insistent, was the only sound she heard clearly. For a fleeting moment, Clara wondered if this was a sign, not just of Max's condition, but of something larger. A warning. A message. Her hand tightened around the bouquet she had picked up again, its wildflowers trembling with her. She looked toward Daniel, his hazel eyes fixed on her with a mixture of worry and determination, and then down at Max, whose amber eyes burned with urgency. Between the two, her heart tugged in conflicting directions. And though she forced a faint smile to steady those watching, deep inside, Clara felt the first cracks of doubt in the foundation of her perfect day. Max had never acted without reason, never broken trust. If he was trying to stop her now, what truth lay hidden in his silent defiance? The laughter of children outside faded, the rustle of dresses stilled, and the prairie wind pushed harder against the chapel doors. It was still Clara's wedding day, but for the first time, she was no longer certain what the day would bring. The murmurs of the guests still swirled like unsettled dust in the air, their voices blending with the creak of the wooden porch and the sigh of the prairie wind. Clara stood torn between the gaze of her fiancé and the pleading eyes of her aging companion, when a new figure stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. The sound of her heels clicking against the chapel's stone steps cut through the noise, and for a moment, even the whispers stilled. It was Maggie Williams, Clara's older sister. She had been absent from Montana for nearly 7 years, choosing instead the restless streets of Seattle as her refuge after their father's death. Maggie was 31 now, her tall frame wrapped in a tailored navy blazer over a simple ivory blouse, her long auburn hair tied into a practical bun that left a few fiery strands framing her sharp cheekbones. Her skin, once kissed by the same Montana sun as Clara's, now carried the faint pallor of city life, though her brown eyes burned with an intensity that never dulled. Those eyes were observant, quick to dissect a scene, and often unreadable, trained from years as an investigative journalist chasing stories that others were too afraid to touch. Maggie had changed since Clara last saw her. She carried herself with the rigid poise of someone who had faced down both corruption and catastrophe with nothing but a pen and a recorder. There was a thin scar just above her left brow, nearly hidden by her hairline, a reminder of an assignment gone wrong when she had been caught in the chaos of a protest turned violent. It was not just a mark of danger survived, it was proof of her stubbornness, her refusal to step back when the truth was at stake. Clara felt her breath catch. The years between them stretched heavy. Their last parting had been bitter, filled with words neither had forgiven. Maggie had accused Clara of burying herself in comfort while she fled to build a career in the city. Clara, wounded, had accused Maggie of running away from family, abandoning their grieving mother. Time had built silence, and silence had hardened into a gulf that neither had crossed until now. Maggie's voice, low and steady, broke the fragile air. "What's going on here?" She moved closer, her eyes shifting from Clara to the German shepherd at her feet. Max's chest rose and fell with labored breaths, his once proud stance trembling as though the effort of holding the gown was draining what little strength he had left. Guests turned, watching the reunion with hungry curiosity. Clara knelt again, torn between joy at seeing her sister and the heavy weight of confusion. Maggie, without hesitation, crouched down, her long fingers brushing against Max's coarse fur. Her touch was practiced, gentle but probing, the way she might handle a fragile clue while chasing a lead. She pressed her palm against his side, feeling the uneven rhythm of his breath, her brows furrowed, her sharp eyes softening into something far more personal than the detachment of a reporter. "He's not just holding you back," Maggie said quietly, almost to herself. "He's calling out. He's begging." The words pierced Clara like a shard of glass. She swallowed hard, memory colliding with present. The past few weeks flashed before her. The untouched food in Max's bowl, the way he had turned away from the treat Daniel had offered, the faint, hacking cough she had dismissed as a sign of old age. Clara's chest tightened with guilt. She had been too consumed with floral arrangements, music lists, and the flurry of wedding preparations to notice what Max had been silently enduring. Clara whispered, "I thought it was just the summer heat. Or maybe he was tired." Maggie's gaze snapped to hers, fierce but not unkind. "No, Clara. Look at him. He's struggling. You know it. You've known it, but you didn't want to see." Clara's throat burned. She shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's my wedding day, Maggie. Everything was supposed to be perfect." "Perfect doesn't matter if you ignore the truth," Maggie replied. Her voice cracked just slightly, betraying the steel facade she wore. She stroked Max's head, her thumb tracing the gray streaks around his muzzle. "He's been holding you together since the day Dad died. Do you really think he'd stop you today without a reason?" The guests shifted uncomfortably, caught between the intimacy of the sisters' exchange and their own unease. Daniel stepped forward again, his hazel eyes narrowing, his voice calm but clipped. "Maggie, with respect, you've just walked back into this family after years away. You don't know Max like we do." Maggie rose to her full height, her tall figure casting a shadow across the porch. She looked Daniel squarely in the eye, her jaw set. "I may not have been here, but I know what it looks like when someone is fighting to be heard. That dog isn't confused. He's in pain, and he's trying to protect her." Daniel's mouth tightened, his stubble catching the light as his jaw clenched. His instinct to defend Clara warred with the gnawing truth in Maggie's words. He glanced at Clara, who stood trembling, caught between them, her gown still trapped gently in Max's teeth. Silence fell again, heavy and suffocating. The prairie wind pressed against the chapel doors, rattling the hinges as though urging them all to act. Max's breathing grew harsher, a low rasp underscoring the stillness. Clara, staring down at him, finally saw what she had refused to admit. The dog who had been her savior through grief was now the one in need of saving. She knelt again, her fingers tangling in his fur, tears slipping down her freckled cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Max. I should have seen it." Her voice was barely audible, yet every guest on the porch seemed to hear it. The fragile perfection of her wedding day was unraveling, but in its place rose something, raw, real, and undeniable. The bond between a woman and the dog who had carried her through every storm. And with Maggie's return, the fragile gulf between the sisters showed the first cracks of healing. The chapel bell swayed with the wind but never rang. Guests shifted on the wooden pews, whispering in confusion as Clara gathered her gown in her arms and made a choice no one expected. She bent down, kissed Max's graying head, and with trembling hands, freed her dress from his teeth. The German shepherd gave a low, rattling sigh, then leaned heavily against her leg as though relieved she had understood. Daniel stepped forward quickly, his strong jaw tightening, eyes dark with worry. "Clara, are you sure about this? The ceremony?" But Clara shook her head, her pale, freckled cheeks wet with tears. "Not yet. Not like this. He needs help." Maggie placed a steadying hand on Clara's shoulder, her tall frame standing solid behind her. Her voice, firm but not unkind, cut through the murmurs. "She's right." He doesn't have time to wait. Daniel's chest rose sharply, his instincts warring between duty to the guests and loyalty to the woman he loved. Finally, he exhaled, shoulders sinking as he nodded. "Then let's go." The three of them, Clara in her lace gown, Daniel in his suit, Maggie in her blazer, walked together down the chapel steps, Max lumbering beside them, his paws dragging faintly on the stone. The scene was surreal. A bride leaving her wedding to save her dog. Gasps followed them, but no one dared stop them. Reverend Paul quietly crossed himself, his kind blue eyes glistening as though he, too, understood. The clinic was a 10-minute drive away, but every second stretched like an eternity. Daniel drove, his large hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw was set hard, stubble shadowing his cheeks, and his hazel eyes flicked constantly between the road and the rearview mirror, where Clara sat cradling Max's head in her lap. Clara's gown spilled across the car seat like snow, but she didn't care about wrinkles or stains. All she saw was Max's labored breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, uneven and shallow. Maggie sat beside her, one arm resting protectively across the back of the seat. Her sharp brown eyes, usually so focused and unflinching, softened as she watched Max. She whispered, almost to herself, "He waited until today to tell you. He didn't want to ruin it for you, but he couldn't keep it hidden anymore." When they reached the clinic, the automatic doors slid open with a chime, releasing the faint, sterile scent of antiseptic and dog shampoo. The waiting room was filled with quiet chaos, families holding anxious cats in carriers, children hugging restless dogs, an elderly man with a trembling chihuahua perched in his lap. Behind the counter sat a young receptionist, a woman in her early 20s with curly blonde hair tied into a bun and bright green eyes magnified slightly behind round glasses. Her name tag read, Kelly. She looked up, startled by the vision of a bride in full gown walking in with a sick German shepherd. Without hesitation, Kelly rose to her feet. Her gentle voice carried authority despite her youth. "We'll take him right away." She stepped from behind the counter, holding the door open to the exam rooms. Her pale skin flushed with urgency as she waved them through, ignoring the murmurs of others in the waiting room. Inside the exam room, the air felt cooler, quieter, but heavy with dread. A moment later, the veterinarian entered. Dr. Robert Scott. He was in his late 40s, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair at his temples and a neatly trimmed beard streaked with silver. His brown eyes, deep-set beneath heavy brows, carried the gravity of someone who had seen both miracles and heartbreak. His navy scrubs bore the faint wrinkles of long hours, and his posture was upright yet softened by years of bending toward animals in need. Dr. Scott had once served in the Army Veterinary Corps, a fact written in the precision of his movements and the calm steadiness of his voice. He had treated military working dogs injured in combat zones, and though he rarely spoke of it, those years had left him with a solemn respect for the silent strength of animals. That experience shaped him into a man both pragmatic and profoundly compassionate. He knelt beside Max without delay, his large hands gentle as they pressed against the shepherd's chest. He listened with his stethoscope, brows furrowing, then checked the gums, the pulse, the eyes. Max, weary but unresisting, leaned into the touch, his amber eyes flicking once toward Clara before closing again. Dr. Scott exhaled slowly and looked up at Clara. "His heart isn't working as it should," he said with quiet gravity. "These signs point to early congestive heart failure. It explains his fatigue, the coughing you may have noticed, and why he's been eating less." The words fell like stones in the room. Clara's pale lips trembled, her green eyes widening with a grief she had feared but never named. "Congestive heart failure?" she whispered. Her hand tightened around Max's paw. Maggie's sharp eyes darkened, her jaw set. She had seen death before, written about it, captured it in ink and photographs. But this was different. This was family. Daniel's broad shoulders sagged. For all his medical training, the helplessness in his hazel eyes betrayed the truth. This was not a patient he could heal. This was Max, the guardian who had raised Clara as much as her own blood had. Dr. Scott's voice was steady, a thread of comfort in the storm. It's not the end today. With medication, with care, he can still have time, good time, with you. But you need to listen to him. Dogs often tell us what they need before we realize it ourselves. Today, he told you in the only way he knew how tears blurred Clara's vision as she bent forward, pressing her forehead against Max's. "You saved me once," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Now it's my turn to save you." Max exhaled a low, rasping breath, and, for a fleeting moment, his tail thumped once against the floor, as if in agreement. The sterile clinic walls closed around them, yet the room was filled not with despair, but with a fragile, aching kind of love. The wedding had been paused, but a different vow was spoken there, one of loyalty, of care, of facing whatever time remained together. The examination room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fur, a sterile space that had become a sanctuary for something far more sacred than medicine. Clara sat on the cool linoleum floor, her white gown spread around her like a halo of lace, one hand resting gently on Max's graying head. The German shepherd's amber eyes fluttered open, finding her, and for a moment she saw in them the same steady gaze that had carried her through the darkest years of her youth. His breathing was heavy, uneven, but his presence remained strong, unyielding even in weakness. Daniel stood nearby, tall and solemn in his gray suit, his broad shoulders slumped with the weight of everything unspoken. His hazel eyes shifted between Clara and Max, torn by helplessness, but anchored by love. He had spent years calming the frantic in emergency rooms, but this moment, watching his bride cradle the dog that had saved her heart, stripped away every professional mask. His jaw tightened, the faint shadow of stubble on his cheeks catching the fading sunlight that slipped through the blinds. He looked not like a doctor, but a man desperate to hold on to the woman he loved and the family she came with. Maggie leaned against the wall, arms crossed over her navy blazer. The scar above her brow caught the glow of the overhead lights, a mark of her battles far from Montana, yet her sharp brown eyes softened as she watched her sister. For all her years of chasing truth and justice in distant cities, this moment, Clara, Daniel, Max, was the story that mattered most. The door creaked open, and Reverend Paul Kearney stepped inside. He had followed them from the chapel, leaving behind rows of confused guests to honor the vows that still needed to be spoken. His thinning silver hair shone softly in the dim light, and his kind blue eyes took in the scene with quiet reverence. The black robe he wore, simple and well-worn, hung loosely over his lean frame, carrying with it decades of baptisms, funerals, and weddings. He had seen love blossom in gilded cathedrals and wither in courthouses, but never had he been asked to sanctify vows in a veterinary clinic. Yet he knew at once that this, more than any marble altar, was holy ground. Behind him came a few of the wedding guests who had trailed nervously after Clara and Daniel. Among them was Hannah, Clara's childhood friend, her honey-brown hair slightly undone from the wind, hazel eyes glistening with unshed tears. She carried the bouquet Clara had dropped earlier, its wildflowers now slightly wilted but still vibrant. Standing beside her was Mrs. Eleanor Grant, an elderly neighbor from Clara's street, her thin frame wrapped in a lilac shawl, her wrinkled hands clutching a tissue she had already soaked through. Their presence was simple but profound. Reminders that family is sometimes chosen as much as it is born. Dr. Robert Scott, his navy scrubs marked faintly with paw prints, lingered near the corner, clipboard in hand but eyes, softened with compassion. Though his role was healer, tonight he stood witness, his broad frame bent slightly as though humbled by the sacredness before him. Beside him, the receptionist Kelly peeked nervously from the doorway, her blonde curls escaping her bun, her round glasses fogged slightly from rushing. Her young face held awe, as if she too realized this was not just another shift at the clinic, but a story she would carry for the rest of her life. Reverend Paul cleared his throat gently, his voice steady but warm. "Dearly beloved," he began, his words filling the small room, "we are gathered here not in the chapel where we planned, but in a place where love has brought us. And is that not the true meaning of marriage? To promise devotion not in the face of perfection, but in the midst of life's imperfections." Clara's tears fell freely, tracing lines across her pale cheeks, but her voice held steady as she looked at Daniel. "You've stood by me through my doubts, through my fears. Today was supposed to be perfect, but perfection doesn't matter. What matters is you. And him." She pressed her hand against Max's head, feeling the soft warmth beneath the silvered fur. "I vow to love you both, to honor what we have, for as long as God gives us." Daniel knelt beside her, his tall frame folding awkwardly in his suit, his broad hand covering hers. His hazel eyes glistened, and for once, the man who had spent years delivering diagnoses found no words. When they came, they were simple and unadorned. "Clara, you are my home, you and Max. Whatever time we're given, whatever storms come, I will be there. This is my vow." The late afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting golden stripes across the floor. The light caught Max's coat, turning the silver streaks into threads of molten gold. He shifted, resting his heavy head fully in Clara's lap, and for one fleeting moment his tail brushed against the floor with a faint thump. It was enough. It was his blessing. Reverend Paul raised his hands, his voice low and reverent. "By the power vested in me by the state of Montana, and by the love I see before me, I pronounce you husband and wife." His blue eyes softened as he added, almost as a prayer, "And may the guardian at your side remind you always of the vows you've spoken today." Applause did not erupt. Instead, silence fell. Deep, sacred, broken only by the sound of Clara's sob, mingling with Daniel's steady breath and Max's uneven rhythm. In that silence lay something greater than celebration. The recognition of love in its truest, rawest form. For those who stood in that room, it was an image etched into memory. Not the bride's gown or the rings exchanged, but the sight of a woman in white, sitting on the floor of a clinic, her hand on the head of an old German shepherd whose eyes had witnessed her childhood grief, her healing, and now her first step into marriage. As the sun dipped lower, casting its final beams across the Montana sky, it painted the room in amber and gold. And in that fading light, love became more than a ceremony. It became a vow carved into the fragile space between life and loss. The wedding at the clinic was remembered not for the vows alone, but for the quiet thump of Max's tail and the golden light that sanctified the room. Life after that moment shifted into something both fragile and profound. Clara and Daniel returned home that evening. No honeymoon in Greece or champagne by the sea. Instead, they carried Max into their modest house on the edge of Livingston, Montana, where the prairie wind rattled the windows and the smell of wild sage drifted in with every breeze. Clara moved through the rooms with a new gentleness, her tall, slender figure in simple cotton dresses, her strawberry blonde hair often tied back loosely as if to free her hands for Max. She still carried the freckles on her pale skin, but her green eyes had deepened with something weightier than before. a quiet determination to honor the promise she had made on the clinic floor. She began every morning on the porch, the mug of coffee in her hand ignored as she stroked Max's thick fur, whispering to him like one might to a beloved child. Daniel, broad-shouldered and rugged in appearance, let go of the small vanities he once held: polished shoes, crisp shirts, precise schedules. His hazel eyes, once clouded by the weight of past tragedies in the hospital, softened as he fell into a new rhythm. Administering Max's pills at dawn and dusk, cooking simple meals that Max would still eat, even if only in small bites. His faint beard grew rougher around the jawline, his shirt sleeves rolled more often, but it gave him a look of sincerity rather than fatigue. The man who once saved strangers with steady hands now saved his own family with patience. Maggie stayed longer than expected, her tall frame filling the kitchen as she wrote at the oak table, her auburn hair pulled into loose knots as she tapped on her laptop. She had taken on freelance reporting, her sharp brown eyes focused on stories of rescue animals, shelter shortages, and the bond between humans and their dogs. Though her scar above the brow remained, it softened against the warmth she found here. In Clara's laughter and Daniel's quiet loyalty, she rediscovered the home she had once abandoned. Max, though weary, seemed to grow younger in the glow of their love. His gray muzzle rested on Clara's lap as she played the piano in the evenings, the music filling the house with the same comfort it had brought when her father was alive. On good days, he still trotted slowly across the yard, his thick black and tan coat catching the Montana sunlight, ears twitching at the sound of meadowlarks. On harder days, when his breathing rasped and his joints stiffened, he curled between Clara and Daniel as they lay on the rug, whispering stories to him, as if words alone could anchor him to the earth. Nearly a year passed in this rhythm, each day measured not by calendars but by Max's heartbeat. Then came the morning when the prairie sky opened clear and blue, stretching endless over the thistle-dotted fields. Clara and Daniel spread a blanket on the grass, where the wind bent the wildflowers into waves. They carried Max outside, his once strong legs too frail to carry him far. His amber eyes were cloudy, yet still searching, still watching. Clara knelt, her pale cheek pressed against his fur, while Daniel's large hands rested steady on his chest. Maggie lifted her camera, her brown eyes shimmering with unshed tears, capturing not for the world, but for them, the last portrait of love. As the sun warmed his coat, Max exhaled one final, soft breath, his body sinking into the embrace of the prairie he had always guarded. The wind stilled, the meadowlark's song paused, and the family held him as if love could tether him longer. Beneath the vast Montana sky, Max passed from this world in the arms of the people he had saved time and again. Grief was heavy, but it was not empty. Clara filled her days with music and teaching, her green eyes brightening when her students asked about Max. Daniel returned to his patients with a softer touch, carrying into every room the memory of a German shepherd who had taught him about loyalty more than any textbook could. Maggie stayed, her words spilling into articles that moved strangers across the country. Together, they built not a house of mourning, but one of gratitude. A year later, Clara found herself once again at the shelter in Great Falls, the same building where she had first met Max 12 years earlier. The chain-link kennels echoed with barking, and the smell of hay and disinfectant lingered. Yet her steps were steadier now, her tall figure upright with quiet strength. Daniel walked beside her, his hazel eyes tired from work but hopeful, his rough hands resting lightly at her back. At the far end of the corridor lay a young German shepherd, broad-shouldered already though barely out of puppyhood. His black and tan coat gleamed, his ears stood tall, and his amber eyes followed her with cautious curiosity. Unlike Max, he barked once, sharp and loud, but then lowered his head in a gesture of uncertain trust. Clara knelt, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the gate, and he pressed his muzzle forward with a hesitation that melted into connection. The shelter worker, a woman in her 50s with graying curls tucked into a bandana and kind brown eyes, smiled. He's called Ranger. Just under 2 years old, smart, stubborn, loyal if you give him reason. Clara's green eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not born of sorrow. She whispered, "Hello, Ranger," her voice breaking into a smile. Daniel crouched beside her, his broad hand sliding against hers on the gate. The dog's amber gaze locked with theirs, and in that gaze Clara felt not replacement, but continuation. When they brought him home, Ranger explored cautiously, his paws padding across the wooden floors, his tail twitching with curiosity. He paused before the fireplace where Max's collar hung in a frame beside a photo of the clinic wedding. Ranger tilted his head, sniffed once, then sat quietly as though acknowledging the guardian who had come before him. Clara knelt beside him, her hand in his fur, and felt it. The thread of love that had begun with Max was not broken. It had only transformed, weaving itself into Ranger's eager heart, guiding them forward into new beginnings. And under the wide Montana sky, love carried on. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive as thunder in the sky or fire from heaven. Sometimes they come on 4 paws, with gray fur, weary eyes, and a heart that refuses to stop protecting us until its final breath. Max was more than a dog. He was a guardian sent to remind Clara, Daniel, and Maggie that love doesn't die. It transforms, and it carries us toward new beginnings. In our daily lives, we are often so busy chasing perfection that we forget to notice the small signs God places before us: a gentle warning, a quiet nudge, a loyal friend who refuses to let us walk into harm. These are not accidents. They are reminders of His presence. And just as Clara learned to listen to Max, may we also learn to pause, to see, and to trust the subtle miracles around us. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it so others may feel the same hope. Leave a comment about a time when God sent you a small miracle, whether through a pet, a friend, or even a stranger. Don't forget to subscribe so together we can keep spreading stories of love, loyalty, and faith. May the Lord bless you, protect your family, and grant you the eyes to see the miracles He places in your path every single day.